move and groove. So why don't y'all stand and sing with us now? So this is how it was, a silent night like any other. Heaven sent the one that we would call our Savior. And redemption began in a stable in Bethlehem. And all of the angels lifted up their voices and filled the night with hallelujahs. God is with us now. Everyone come and join the heavenly chorus. Our Savior King is here before us. Oh, to hear the sound, the song creation sang when hope came down. So this was truly God, wrapped up in a tattered blanket. Hope was finally here, sleeping while the world awakened. And redemption began with a baby in Bethlehem. All of the angels lifted up their voices and filled the night with hallelujahs. God is with us now. Everyone come and join the heavenly chorus. Our Savior King is here before us. Oh, to hear the sound, the song creation sang when hope came down. So let us sing redemption songs. Let us worship Christ the Holy One. We were lost, but we were found when hope came down. Come on, church, sing it out. So let us sing redemption songs. Let us worship Christ the Holy One. We were lost, but we were found when hope came down. And all of the angels lifted up their voices and filled the night with hallelujahs. God is with us now. Everyone come and join the heavenly chorus. Our Savior King is here before us. Oh, to hear the sound, the song creation sang when hope came down. When hope came down. Amen. Y'all sound beautiful this morning. Now that you're awake and alive, why don't you go ahead and greet somebody around you, and then you can have a seat.
All right. Well, we are so glad that you guys are here with us. And so, there's a little bit of something going on there. And so, we're glad you guys are here with us, either in person or online. We realize our online crowd has been bigger the last couple of weeks, and so we're so glad to have you with us. We are promising the online crowd that we are investing in our audio equipment. We're changing everything over, and so in a few weeks, hopefully, you won't have any technical difficulties and have to turn your TV all the way up or your iPad. So for you guys in the room, you probably don't know about that, but if you ever watch online, it can be frustrating at times. So anyway, so we're committed to that. And so the other thing is we sent a video out this week about Christmas Eve. And so as of right now, we're opening things back up, obviously still in limited capacity with everything. And so Christmas Eve services this year, to kind of limit the crowd size at each service, we're going to be offering 3 different services. And so those will be at 6:30, did I say that right? 6:30, 7:45 and 9. Those are the times. I made them up and I don't even remember what times they were. So 6:30, 7:45, and 9. Each service will last about 45 minutes. We will be offering childcare this year. So typically in the past for Christmas Eve, we have the whole family in here for a service. And so we decided this year to kind of change things up to again limit crowd size in certain areas. And so there'll be childcare and student ministry offered if you choose to come. We'll also have those online as well. And so we're so glad you guys are here with us. And so we've been talking about God's love for us the last couple weeks. And I've had a lot of good conversations with people that have emailed me or spoken to me after the services. And so some of the stuff we've been talking about deals directly with one aspect of when it comes to understanding kind of where we are as people. And so today what I want to do is talk about this specific aspect. And we've talked about this a little bit over a year ago. And so we're going to revisit part of it here today. And so I told you guys a few weeks ago that when I started preaching, I was in a preaching class one time and I preached a sermon. And the teacher was like, you might want to think about doing something else. And he didn't say it that way, but it was basically that. And so I started making up some own rules that I wanted to follow. And so the first rule that I have when it comes to communicating is this, and this is a true statement for all kinds of communication, whether it's from a stage or in a counseling session or just talking with friends or even speaking with my family. It's not what I say, it's what you hear. And so what we have to do is be careful how we say certain things so that they hear what you're actually trying to communicate. And so I'm going to try to be as clear as I can today as I have in the past when talking about this. And there's another kind of rule when it comes to communication that I live by that we'll get to in a minute. But the other thing is this. With this conversation, for anybody in this room or tuning online or anybody that watches later on the podcast, I do want to say this. I don't think that I'm going to fix anybody. And that's not even my goal when we talk about these things, is to fix someone, and that's even bad language to use when it talks about this subject. That is not the goal of this conversation, but rather to take a step in the right direction. And so 2020 has been quite a year for many of us in this room, or if you're tuning in online as well. So much has happened to people as a whole when it comes to the global pandemic that we've been going through, regardless of what your beliefs are or your feelings are or emotions are towards that. It has been a lot on everyone. And so we've got all of that going on, and then that has affected us culturally, the way we do things, the way we operate, the way we engage each other. It's also affected our nation in some ways politically. And so in this year, obviously being an election year, and probably one of the craziest election years that I can remember in my lifetime at least. So it's affected our nation politically, which then has affected us socially. And this year has also had an impact on many of us personally. And so there's so much confusion, I feel like, as I talk to people and as I hear people talk about things. There's also a lot of anger. There's also a lot of fear. There's a lot of hurt that's happened this year between people and with people's things that have happened in their lives. And there's also a lot of pain. That a lot of us have had a lot of pain in our lives this year. And the results of all of that combined have been unparalleled to any point that I can remember in my life. In a culture that's already full of people struggling with depression, in a culture of people already struggling with an overwhelming sense oftentimes of disconnection and loneliness, where people suffer from anxiety all the time, a culture where we've learned to self-medicate in sometimes often the most unhealthy of ways. It's also a culture, too, where we pretend like it's okay to say we're not okay, but then also as soon as we say we're not okay, we immediately get chastised by groups around us asking us why we're not okay. And some of us, the problem is, even if we're not okay, we would never admit it to anybody. And so what we do, as we talked about last week, we present a false self. One of the things that I've learned in doing this for 20 years is that sometimes the people with the brightest smiles also have the deepest and darkest fears and doubts in their heart. There's this great quote that came from Brené Brown, and you've heard me quote her a lot recently, and she says this pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability. And here's one thing I know about us as people: we don't like being vulnerable. We can be our worst selves when we're afraid, or we can be our very best, bravest selves. In the context of fear and vulnerability, there's often very little in between, because when we are uncertain and afraid, our default is self-protection. And one of the things I know about human beings when it comes to self protection of our rights, of our beliefs, of our life itself, it can get really good or it can get really nasty really quick. And I don't need to get into the overwhelming statistics of this year, and they are overwhelming when you actually take the time to look at them. But divorce rates, people struggling with mental health, suicide, all of these things combined with all the things we've already talked about led me to the point where I feel like we just need to address it for 1 week and just talk about it a little bit. And so, what I want to do is just take a minute and just allow us to be honest with ourselves, whether you're in person or online, and just be honest. Because here's the thing: everybody in this room, either yourself or you know someone that probably struggles with depression, anxiety, fear, or whatever it is, been brought on by the things that have happened not only of this year, but also the things that have happened over the course of our lives. It's not far from us. It's a real part of our life. It's a real part of our community. It's a real part of our culture. And it's not just something we just talk about theoretically. It's actually something that people in this room or people watching online right now are going through. And I can tell you that in my own life that there have been moments of overwhelming sense of aloneness and disconnection. It's just this thing that we experience as human beings. And what's strange in the moments where we feel these things, whether it's fear or anger or disconnection or depression or loneliness or whatever it is that we wrestle with, what's strange in those seasons of our life is often what ends up happening is the things that we actually need to invite into our life we run from, and the things that we need to bring into our life that could actually help heal us sometimes are the things we abstain from. And part of this is a fear of just having the conversation. Nobody wants to admit that everything's not okay. And some of it is just stuff that we can't, it's not you, it's things going on in our bodies and our brains. And some of it is just our inability to deal with some of this stuff. I love this quote from Barbara Brown Taylor, and you're going to hear me quote a lot of smart women today. I don't know why men don't talk about this, but maybe that's a problem in and of itself. But here's what she says. She says, one of the main things that tip people toward garden variety depression is a low tolerance for sadness. It is the inability to bear dark emotions that causes many of our most significant problems, and not the emotions themselves. Did you catch that? It's not the emotions themselves. Emotions are normal, they're natural, they're built into us. There's periods of life where we're going to feel sad and angry and upset and all of these things. It's our inability to deal with those things. When we cannot tolerate the dark, we try all kinds of artificial lights, including but not limited to drugs, alcohol, shopping, shallow sex, and hours in front of a television set or a computer. There are no dark emotions, just unskillful ways of coping with emotions we cannot bear. The emotions themselves are conduits of pure energy that want something from us, to wake us up, to tell us something we need to know, to break the ice around our hearts, or to move us to act. And it's like this moment where we have this stuff inside of us that we're dealing with, and the question is, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do? And sometimes these emotions that we have, they're wanting to tell us something about ourselves, something that we often choose to ignore, that we actually really need to pay attention to. So there's this passage of scripture we've talked about before, and it's kind of this amazing story. It takes place in 1 Kings chapter 19. It's this really old story, and in this story that we see, there's this guy named Elijah, and he's one of these great prophets. In fact, many consider him one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. And there's this moment where what's happening in Israel at the time is there's all of this stuff that's coming down on them, all of these dark forces that are coming down on them, all of this confusion that's coming down on them. I wish we could relate to that, but maybe not. Okay, so that was a joke. So there's all this stuff, and they're really confused about what's going on in their culture and in their city. And to cap all that off, there's this person that's kind of coming down on them. Her name is Jezebel, and her husband's name is Ahab. And they are worshiping this other god, the prophets of Baal, and Baal's kind of their god. It represents all these other gods. And so they're coming down on the people of Israel, and
All right, so here we go. Okay, so anyway, so there's this showdown that's going to take place, and so the prophets of Baal have kind of decided that they're going to take on Elijah and God and what he represents. And so in this famous scene that happens, they build these altars and they decide that they're going to pray to their God to come down and to kind of show this sign. And so in this famous scene, what happens is all of these prophets, and there's over 900 prophets of Baal, they're standing there and they're praying to their God. And so they have this altar laid out. And what ends up happening is they get to this place where the gods aren't listening. So what they do is their belief is that in order for God to respond, we have to hurt ourselves. And so they start to cut themselves. See, their belief about God is that if you want a response from God, you have to do something. That their God is not a God that gives, their God is a God that takes. And so there's this moment where they're mutilating themselves, and there's really this agonizing moment. And Elijah kind of is watching all of this, and he starts to taunt them because nothing's happening. And so he has these famous lines where he says, maybe your God's not available, or maybe he's indisposed right now, maybe he's using the restroom or something like that. And so then it's his turn. And so after all this kind of awkwardness, he simply says this simple prayer, and God sends down this fire on this altar that Elijah has covered with water. I mean, it's just like this amazing moment. And after that, God gives Elijah the strength to take on all of the prophets of Baal. Now, this is an important part of the story, because if you ever thought that if God did something in my life, I would never doubt again. Like, if God had this moment where he sends down fire into my life and he wipes out all of my enemies, well, then of course it's easy to believe in God. Because the problem in our life is we don't think that God has shown up in a big enough way. And that's why we wrestle through the things we wrestle with. And if God would show up in just the right way, then maybe we wouldn't feel these things anymore. I mean, the reason you doubt, the reason you fear, the reason you're stressed out, the reason you're anxious, the reason you're depressed, the reason you struggle with despair is because God hasn't shown up and revealed some type of fire in your life. I mean, that's what we believe. And so there's this moment where this amazing thing has happened. And so Jezebel hears about it. All of her prophets have been wiped out, and she's kind of been put on display for not worshiping God. And Jezebel is considered one of the evilest women and people really to ever live. That's why you don't meet a lot of daughters named Jezebel, okay? And now Ahab hears what's going on, and so he goes to his wife, and in 1 Kings 19 he says this. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all of the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. And so she threatens him. This is an amazing moment in this story, because Elijah has just seen literally God send down fire and consume this altar, and he's given him the strength to take on all of his enemies and defeat them. Now, if you were there and you experienced something like that in your life, don't you think that would give you enough faith for, I don't know, like a week, right? At least. And literally the next day, when this threat is made on Elijah's life, in which he should respond with, come on, what do you got? Verse 3 tells us this. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. After just experiencing one of the most amazing things that God could do in his life, another threat, another fear comes his way, and his anxiety and his fear and his feeling of insignificance takes over, and his human side responds, and so he goes and he runs. See, what happens in our lives is sometimes we experience these amazing seasons where God has done amazing things in our life. And maybe our life, if we really took a look at it, is this amazing story of God intervening at different parts of our life and sending us what we need. But guess what? There's always going to be another threat. There's always going to be another season where we question that. And Elijah has this moment where he's overwhelmed and he's afraid. And the reality is that I'm really encouraged by that. Because if Elijah can be terrified and run from his life just after the moment that God shows up the most, maybe there's hope for you and me. And the interesting thing that we're going to see is in this period of his life where he chooses to run, he thinks he's running from God, but God is running with him. And that lets me know that you might be having the worst moment or the worst year, but you may actually be closer to God than you think. See, one of the practical things I want to say when it comes to mental health and struggling with depression and anxiety and despair is that oftentimes we believe that means we're not connected to God anymore. And I think that sometimes what ends up happening in the faith conversation is if you're struggling with stuff, well, people tell you just need to get right with God and then you'd be okay. And so what happens is now all of a sudden you have all of this despair, all of these feelings inside of you, and now on top of that, guess what else you're dealing with? Guilt and shame, because you don't have enough faith. Maybe you don't have to know how to deal with your anxiety yet. Maybe you don't know how to deal with your depression yet and your fear. But let me tell you this. There's not guilt and shame in that. If anyone has told you that on a person of faith, that you're lacking in faith and that's why you're going through this, you need to know that is not the message that we see in the scriptures. In fact, oftentimes we talk about wrestling with God, and the word wrestling that we see is an intimate term in the Old Testament, because you can't wrestle with someone that's far away. You wrestle with someone that's close. So here's this moment where Elijah, this is something that happens to all of us a lot. The reason we feel depressed is because you can't imagine better yourself. So that's a really negative possible. This right now. And it's happening all right now. That is the sound. And so you're actually and the reason it brings is you're so honest. See, so used to so Elijah we also see if this one goes, we're just quitting. All right. So there's this imagery is beautiful, and he's in the wilderness, and so he runs to the wilderness. And he's in the desert, and so he runs to the desert. So recap, because there's been a lot of distractions happening right now. So here is this moment where he's having to deal with all of this. And he gets to this moment where, and here's my belief about Elijah, and I can't prove it through the text, but here's the human nature of me. This isn't the first time he's felt like this. And whatever you're going through, it's probably not the first time you felt like it either. It's just all of a sudden it becomes this overwhelming situation, and Elijah's done. And so in verse 4, he says this, I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And there's this moment where he's just given up, and he's done. And I hope that you never have a moment in your life where you feel like you can't take one more step. But I know people who have. And I know people in this room who've said they felt like that before. And so Elijah comes to the end of himself. He does not want to live one more day. He cannot take any more of this life. And so he asks God to take his life from him. And then he falls asleep. And it got me thinking, because I've really gotten into kind of like, and you probably know this, the science behind a lot of what makes us as human beings. And obviously there's a spiritual element, but there's also this physical element. And there's this interesting thing about energy that we carry in our lives. And have you ever noticed that when you are overwhelmed by life, you just don't have any energy? Like you're just drained. And there's this moment where we're in relationships and they drain us. Or maybe you like been in a job before and it's a terrible job and you're just drained and you don't have any energy. And what we find is if you spend enough time in the wrong place, you will have a limited amount of energy. because your energy is getting less and less and less, and you're getting tired all of the time, mentally, physically, spiritually. When we're in these places we're not supposed to be, it just drains us. And so Elijah is feeling drained. And he falls asleep, and God sends this angel, and here's what the angel says. Ready? All at once, an angel touched him and said, "You lousy, lazy, unbelieving, faithless prophet, why in the world did God waste his time with you?" That's not actually in the Bible. But that's what we think, isn't it? When we go through this stuff, this is what we think. Or it's the conversation we have in church that when someone struggles, it's this thing where, why would God, listen, you are unbelieving, you're lazy. But that's not the conversation that happens. And so God sends him an angel, and here's what he actually says. He says, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water, and he ate and drank, and then he laid down again. You ever been in that place where all you have the strength for is to sit in your bed and eat, right? And the problem with this is usually we grab donuts, and then we're like, I'm grabbing some donuts, and I'm going back to bed, right? I'm done. But the angel of the Lord came back a second time, verse 7, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up, ate and drank, strengthened by his food. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So here's a couple practical things that we have to know about ourselves as human beings that I've observed. If you're not actually taking care of yourself physically, it often affects you spiritually. If you're not able to do this, if you're not resting, if you're not eating, and if you're not drinking well, and sometimes we have to let the physical side of us get healed in order for the spiritual side of us to flourish. And so the question is, what are we putting into our bodies? Okay? And what are we pouring into our minds? And I think we're really good at pouring Netflix into our brains, right? I mean, we're really good at pouring that stuff in, right? And we're really good at pouring terrible food into our bodies. I mean, what is the nutritional value of Cheetos? I don't know, okay? And we'll stay up till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because we can't go to sleep, or we're watching TV, or we're playing video games, or we're online scrolling and doing all of these things. And then we wonder why we're exhausted the next day. And we wonder why our relationships are short, and why we're always angry and coming down on people and yelling at people, and we have a short temper. It's because you don't actually have the energy to pour into it to make it a proper relationship. I think God created sleep and rest so that it could be a part of our lives, and he created this idea of taking care of ourselves. And here's the thing. When we're in bad places, we have to take care of ourselves. And the only thing, guys, in the story, not only does he tell him to eat and sleep, but after he's ate and he slept, he tells him to get up, and he's going to go for a hike to a mountain. And here's the thing I know about myself, and I know it's true of a lot of people, is when I eat bad, I feel bad. And when I don't sleep, you will know it, I promise. And when I don't get to the gym or get my run in, I get really, really grumpy. And it's like the ability to take care of ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And this idea of allowing energy into our bodies and taking care of ourselves. And the reality is that Elijah, up until that point, he didn't have any energy left. And so he has to eat, and he has to sleep, and rest. And then he gets up, and he takes care of himself. So that's one aspect of it, that when it comes to these things that we feel that lead us down these dark places, is we're just not taking care of ourselves. And we don't take care of ourselves when we already mentally are in a bad place. It's not going to end well. The second thing is this. In the next verse, he says this: "I am the only one left." There's this moment where he feels like he's completely alone. And there's nobody else. I'm the only prophet on your side. I'm the only one that's following you. And what we have to understand sometimes when we're going through this, and I know this is sensitive to a lot of people, is the reason that you believe that you're the only one, the reason that you go into those dark places emotionally and mentally, is because physically you have removed yourself from everybody else. You physically have made yourself alone. And that's what he's done. He's gone to this place where he's isolated. He has a servant. He leaves his servant before he goes on this trip. He has isolated himself from everybody. And here's the thing we have to understand about ourselves as humans. We were created for relationship. There's an interesting story that takes place in Genesis where God is with Adam and they're doing life and they're doing relationship together. And there's this great line where God says, "It is not good for man to be alone." Now, there's an interesting kind of idea behind that because man is not alone. He has God. But even in this story, even in this perfect relationship with God, it was insufficient without a relationship with another human being. And so some of the times that we go into these dark places is because we physically have isolated ourselves from everybody around us. And if you've done that, well, then of course you feel alone. One of the things that I see so often is people say things like, well, it's just me and God, or it's just me and Jesus. I don't need church. And here's the thing about that. You can't really do Jesus without doing church because church was Jesus' idea. He created us for community. He created us for relationships. And God, and this is the crazy thing about it, it's often people who break us the most, but it's often people that are also the ones that can help put us back together. And so you can't allow the past pain to close you off from future healing. That you need people. You need to surround yourself with people. You need to surround yourself with people that can encourage you. Have you ever noticed there's people in your life that when you're with them, they just drain you? And then there's people that when you're with them, they charge you back up. So this idea of you're all by yourself, you're not. It may feel like that, and you may have put yourself in that position, but I guarantee you there are people that care about you and love you. In verse 11 says this, "Then the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence," because Elijah just kind of had this pity party where he's by himself. He says, "Go off under the presence of the Lord is about to pass you by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. It's amazing sometimes that God speaks in the whispers. We want these big, great signs, and we're ignoring the obvious. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, I love this question because let me say this first. I realize that a lot of what you are going through, for some of us, it's not us. And there's chemical imbalances, and there's things from our past, and there's all of this stuff that has led us into these places. But sometimes we just need to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? What are you doing in this place where you've isolated yourself from everybody? What are you doing in this place right now? It goes back to last week. The first question that God ever asks of man is, where are you? And sometimes we have to be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, where are we? And then the second question is not only where are we, but here's the other question nobody wants to deal with is, why are we here? And in this story, he hears the still voice of God, and then God encourages him. You have to read the rest of the story in the chapter, but essentially what happens is God sends him out of the cave to a community of people because he doesn't need to be by himself. And his intention in life is to go out and to see these people who encourage him, people who will make him feel good, people who will recharge him. And when he leaves the cave and he goes and finds these people after he's rest, after he's ate, after he slept, after he realizes he's not alone, and the end of the chapter ends with Elijah kind of having this realization of who he is and what he's here to do. And the next thing we see is he's back to ministering to people. And I want to encourage us as a community is we need each other. And it's been clear to me as the lead pastor of this community who can't get any microphones to work, but anyway, we're not supposed to do this alone. I need community as much as you need community. And so we have to grab some people, grab someone. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you're struggling. I know that tomorrow can be better than today, but it doesn't happen by accident. It happens by the choices that we make and the willingness to take a step closer to the health that we need mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And what some of us need to do is to take a moment and to think about and define the next step that we need to take. Some of us, we have people in our life that are already speaking wisdom into our life, and we need to stop ignoring them. Some of us have people in our life that we've pushed away because we're in this moment and in this season, and we think we're by ourselves, when really there's people around us that want to love us and embrace us and help us through this. I love this quote from Rebecca Lyons. She says, let's not shame mental health with judgment of spiritual weakness. As Christians, we believe this is the side of heaven. We believe this side of heaven, all disease, sickness, and pain is rooted in a world broken by sin. But there are real consequences to living amidst the mess. To oversimplify these complexities would be naive at best, negligent at worst. Faith should never undermine the necessity for doctors or medications and therapy, because we want to deploy every effort afforded to us when we tackle our brokenness. I believe in the 3 P's when it comes to healing. You need prayer and people, and sometimes you need pills, okay? And sometimes we need a combination of all 3. When you are suffering as a Christian, everyone wants to give you a pep talk, while almost no one wants to sit with you in the darkness. Everyone offers to pray for you or give you advice, but there's not a lot of people that want to walk with you through the pain. And we need to be people who are willing to walk, sometimes in silence. Now, if you're struggling, I want to give you one practical step for today. See, Elijah runs for his life because he's probably the most powerful prophet that's ever lived. But he ran away because he was afraid. He was afraid because he didn't know what was going to happen next. And he was afraid because he felt out of control. And that's actually one of the most important things behind worship. It's this process of shifting responsibility. And I'm not saying that we should be irresponsible and just not take any responsibility for our lives, but here's what I'm saying. When you walk into this place or tune in online, I hope you can still hear us, and you're stressed out or you're depressed or you're anxious or you're overwhelmed by life, because life is hard and overwhelming. And by the way, Jesus tells us that. Right before he leaves the earth, he says, in this world you will have trouble. But he also tells us we're not meant to carry it by ourselves. And here's where a lot of us are. You have taken on responsibility for things you do not have the power to carry. And when you're worshiping, there's something that's happening where you feel this connection. And you have this minute where you feel like you need to give it over to him. And there's like this connection there. It's like this shift of responsibility of you saying, God, I can't do this by myself. I need to give this to you. The problem is the song always ends, doesn't it? The worship always ends. And that's why as people, we need to shift from the idea of worship being singing to actually the way that we live. To realign the internal narrative that this thing that we are facing in life is bigger than us and it's not ours to bear alone. That we need God and we need a community of people. And what's interesting is that for many of us, the idea of surrendering this to someone else seems strange. But the reality is, here's what we do as humans. We surrender things all the time. We surrender so much of our life to relationships, to our jobs, to things like Instagram and Facebook. If we can just get enough likes, then we'll be happy, right? Or sports or whatever it is. And some of us surrender our lives to things that just numb us. And so we surrender all of the time to many things that take mastery over our life. And yet we walk into church and we refuse to surrender to the thing we need to surrender to the most. I think one of the pushbacks that a lot of us have is this. It's one of these decisions to surrender to God in worship is to trust someone you cannot see. And that seems a little bit irrational to some of us, except for this. Depression, anxiety, stress, despair, you can't see them either. But you feel it, don't you? Jesus makes this promise to us. He says, in this world you will have trouble. In verse 16, verse 33, he says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. There's this great quote from Barbara Brown Taylor. One last one, and she says this. Even light fades and darkness falls, as it does every single day and every single life. God does not turn the world over to some other deity. Here is the testimony of faith. Darkness is not dark to God. The night is as bright as the day. Which leads me to my other rule in communication. First one is it's not what I say, it's what you hear. The second one is it's not what I say, it's what I do that matters the most. And God doesn't just say, He does. And in our darkness, God gives us light. In fact, He gave us the light of the world. And we'll talk more about that next week. Let's pray. Father God, we love you. And God, I pray that for so many of us in this room, either ourselves or someone we know that is struggling with these ideas, that today was not a distraction. And there were a lot of distractions. But God, that at the end of the day, this coupled with what we've talked about the last couple of weeks is that we know that you love us. And we know that even when we run, that you run after us. And God, we know that these things that we are carrying, we are not meant to carry by ourselves. And we need connection, and we need people, and we need people in our life that will be honest with us. We need people in our life that will show us wisdom. And God, we need to be connected to those people that will help us and walk with us in the dark things that we face and the troubled times that we face. God, the other thing is that we need to learn to give things over. So many of us in this room, me included, want to control every outcome. And we try to carry things in this life that we were not meant to carry. And we definitely weren't meant to carry by ourselves. And so God, help us to trust. Help us to learn to hand things over, to let go of things that need to be let go of, to put our trust in you, to believe that even in our darkest moments, God, that you're with us and that there's light. And God, we just have to wait and we have to rest and we have to feed ourselves and take care of ourselves and to take steps towards that light, to take steps towards that hope so that we can be whole and the people that you created us to be. And so, God, my prayer is that we believe that we trust that, and that, God, everybody listening will hear that and take the next step they need to take towards you. And so we love you and we thank you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
We come to this time in our service where we're going to take a second, we're going to pause, and we're going to reflect, and we're going to intentionally be still and be with God. And we're also going to take communion. And before you take communion, I just want to set it up for you. It's easy to get into a rhythm and just a routine, and this is just what we do. We come here, we do these things, and we move on. But let me put some life behind the things you're doing. That as you take the juice, remember that that was physical blood that was shed for you. And as you eat that wafer, remember that that was the physical, that represents the physical body of Jesus Christ, who walked this earth, who dealt with the struggles that we deal with, and willingly gave his life for you. And he did all of these things for you because he saw immeasurable value in you because of who you are and not because of what you've done. That he would surrender everything he had just to bring you into a relationship with him. That's why we're here. This isn't a fix your life course. This isn't a try harder, be better. Like Jeremy said, this is a full surrender. And it's a full surrender to the King who has given everything up for you so that you can call him Father and so that he can look down on you and call you son and daughter. So as we take a second, we intentionally pause and we intentionally give you a moment. Just be with God now. Ask the questions you have. Pour out your heart to him now. Pour out your gratitude for the breath that's in your lungs today, for the gift of life that he's given each one of us, and for the hope that he's given us through Jesus Christ. And when you're ready, you can join us in worship. tears are on the cross, where you gave it all. I worship you, I worship you. See the one who saves, light of heaven's grace. I run to you, I run to you, and I surrender. I lay my life down at your feet. Oh God of mercy, you are worthy. I give you every part of me. Things that I have done, the things that I will do, I give to you, I give to you. Holy God above, how could I resist your love? I run to you, I run to you, and I surrender. I lay my life down at your feet. Oh God of mercy, you are worthy. I give you every part of me. With every breath, with all I am, oh Jesus, I surrender. My heart is yours, I trust you, Lord. Oh Jesus, I surrender. Come on, church, you mean to sing it out. With every breath, with all I am, oh Jesus, I surrender. Come on, church. My heart is, give it to him. I trust you, Lord. Oh Jesus, to you, Jesus, I surrender. I lay my life down at your feet. God of mercy, you are worthy. I give you every part of me. Let's give it to him. And I surrender. I lay my life down at your feet. Oh God of mercy, you are worthy. I give you every part of me. I am not what I made, I am who you made me to be. And I am not what I've done, I am loved unconditionally. measure of love that I bring. And I am not who I know, I am known by the King of all kings. Come on, church, let's sing this out. Jesus, you are enough. Jesus, you are enough for me. With nothing, I still have everything. Jesus, you are enough for me. You are made to make visible, holding the world in your hands. You are patient and merciful, giver of grace without end. Satisfied simply by being who you've always been. You are infinite love, and you prove it again and again. Come on, church, let's sing this out to him. Jesus, you are enough. Jesus, you are enough for me. With nothing, I still have everything. Jesus, you are enough for me. Jesus, you are enough. Jesus, you are enough for me. With nothing, I still have everything. Jesus, you are enough for me. Let's pour it out to him. In you I am created. In you I am sustained. With you I'm resurrected. You overcame the grave. With you I stand in victory. Now what else could I need? Come on. With you I want for nothing. Jesus, my everything. Jesus, you are enough. Jesus, you are enough for me. With nothing, I still have everything. Jesus, you are enough for me. Jesus, you are enough. Jesus, you are enough for me. With nothing, I still have everything. Jesus, you are enough for me. Amen. Thank you all so much for letting us worship together, to come in and just united together as one family. It's just an amazing thing. So thank you so much for letting us be a part of that with you. I said at the beginning, and I meant it, if this is your first time with us, there's nothing special about us. You can clearly see that. We have lots of mics that fail and lots of problems. But our God is an amazing God. But we do want to say thank you for coming out, and we'd like to honor you with a gift. So if this is your first time here with us, if you don't mind stopping down there at the welcome area, no questionnaires to fill out, no phone numbers to give, but we do have a gift, just our way of saying thanks for coming out and hanging out with us this morning. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I love you. God, we love you. God, and we praise you that you are a God that never gives up on us and never gave up on us long before we were even born. And that, God, you have given up everything to bring us into a relationship with you so that we can call you Father. God, and we praise you for that. God, I pray that as we walk through this life, that we would surrender who we are. God, that we can see the purpose that you have called us for is so much bigger than ourselves. God, and instead of clutching on to the little bit that we have control over, God, let us surrender everything we have to you so that we can find life, and life to the fullest in you. God, we love you. God, we praise you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Have a great week.